Hello and welcome to my channel, and a happy new year to everyone. Today I have a winter landscape for you, and I'm going to be using colored pencils on sandpaper. Of course, as you can see, the main part of this scene is this large mountain in the middle, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So let's have a look. I'm mostly going to be using Faber-Castell colored pencils, but a couple of others as well. The first thing I did was to draw the outline of the mountain, or the top edge of the mountain, because I'm going to be working on the sky first. And I want to be able to have a clean edge. So I want to avoid having to work with other colors over that blue color. The colors that I'm going to use for the sky are going to be light phthalo blue and a sky blue. The sky blue is a little bit cooler, the phthalo blue is a little bit warmer. I'm going to combine these two, and I hope that I'll get a nice looking sky. I'm also going to use these colors for the snow as well in the rest of the scene. For blending, I'm using blending stumps and brushes. Blending stumps do a pretty good job at blending colored pencils on sandpaper, because colored pencils tend to blend a little bit better on sandpaper than they do on regular paper. But occasionally I also use the brushes as well to make things a little bit more even. But I mustn't overdo it with them, because they tend to kind of scratch the pigment out of the paper and reveal too much of the background color. And I want to cover this part of the paper entirely. I don't want any of the background color to come through, because with sandpapers you have a limited number of colors, and this one is kind of darker gray, and I need my sky to be a lot lighter. So I want this part of the drawing to be covered thoroughly with these two blue colors. Now in some other parts of the drawing I'm actually going to use this darker color, the background color, to my advantage, and I'm mostly going to do that when I start drawing the mountain, especially the shadow side of the mountain. So I'm going to be using this cooler sky blue color on top of the light phthalo blue, and combining these two to cover this sky nicely. And I want a clear blue sky without any clouds. The mountain itself is going to be far more complex. Now once I finish with that, and like I said, it's important for me to cover everything and to make everything look smooth. Once I finish that, I'm going to move on with the mountain. But I want to avoid having any texture in the sky. I want it to look fairly smooth. So before I started working on the mountain itself, I made sure that my edges were clean, because I want to have a nice clean edge for the mountain. And after that I started working with a white colored pencil. Now it's a snow-covered mountain, but it's not going to be completely white, obviously, because it has its light side and its shadow side. The light source is usually coming from above when you're drawing landscapes, but it's coming more from one side than the other. In this case it's coming more from the right. So my light source is on the right, the shadow side is on the left. So I'm going to try to reflect that in my mountain by making sure that each and every one of those parts of the mountain, or surfaces of the mountain which is facing towards the light source, is lighter, and those slopes or parts of the mountain which are facing away from the light source, they have to be darker. In addition to the Faber-Castell Polychromos white colored pencil, I also used a Staedtler white colored pencil, because that one is a little bit less opaque, so I used it so that I can blend it a bit more easily in some parts where I maybe don't want the whites to be quite as strong. Now here I decided to add another peak, so I added a bit more of that white colored pencil to make it look like that part of the mountain is sticking out and catching some light from above. So for the shadow side first, I added a touch of white so that I could be able to create something like a lighter grayish color. But obviously I want some other colors in there as well. So I added a bit of that sky blue color. And this, combined with the background color of my sandpaper, is actually going to give me a nice color for the shadow side, a nice shadow color. And you can see that I already have a decent amount of contrast between the light side and the shadow side. This is very important because it is this contrast that will allow us to explain the shape of the mountain to the viewer. Because if you just make it look flat, then it's not going to be much of a mountain. We want to show a very uneven rocky surface with a lot of these jagged edges and interesting shapes. And in this shadow side of the mountain, I'm also going to add a touch of that phthalo blue color as well, just so that I could have a bit of that color which I have in the skies, just so that I could have it elsewhere in my landscape. Now I'm working a little bit more on the light side by drawing, by using some more of this white colored pencil. And notice that I'm drawing this with interrupted marks here and there because I don't want to cover everything. And the reason why I'm doing it is because I want to make it look like it's a very uneven surface where there are a lot of these smaller rocks which are kind of facing away from the light source. And I want to have some of these darker bits as well, which are even darker than the shadow in the shadow side. So I want to make it look like some of these rocks are not only facing away from the light source, but maybe some of them are kind of jutting out, and maybe some of them are not covered by snow, or at least their sides are not covered by snow. So I want to have a nice range of value, and I want to use these, I want to use those contrasts and that range of value to be able to explain to the viewer that this is a very rough, rocky surface. So you can see that in the shadow side I'm actually using a black colored pencil in addition to the other pencils which I used for the shadow color. And I'm using this for some of these darker rocks because I don't want to have the shadow side looking completely monotonous. Now you can do that sometimes depending on the effect that you're trying to achieve, but I like to add a bit of detail in the shadow as well. And I'm going over some of these darker bits with a bit of Prussian blue because I want to stay consistent with those bluish tones that I started using. And you can see that the shape of this shadow here on this mountain peak is starting to look really nice, and that the light side of that part of the mountain is really popping out. And that's why it was also important for me to shade the sky and to do the sky first, because now you can see how nicely those white parts are popping out and how much more three-dimensional the mountain is starting to look. I'm adding some more random details on the side of the mountain here by using a black colored pencil. Now I told you that I'm mostly going to be using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, but in addition to the black colored pencil, the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, I'm also going to be using the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil, which is a little bit darker. So I use that for some of the areas where I feel like maybe the Faber-Castell one isn't dark enough. Or maybe it's not dark enough because I already put down some lighter colors under it and I need something a little bit stronger. This bottom part of the mountain, I kind of blended that with a blending stump because I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it yet. I didn't really put too much detail in there because I know that I wanted to have some trees in there, but I didn't really work out the composition exactly to every single detail, so I decided to leave some of these things for later once I start working on the midground and the foreground. And I also wasn't really sure whether I was going to make it look like the bottom of the mountain was in the mist, or a little bit clearer where we can see more of those trees. So here, once I started moving on to the foreground, I decided to add a few of the taller trees which are closer to us, closer to our viewpoint. And I started by drawing one right here on the left side, a tall coniferous tree, and I'm drawing a tall tapering shape of its canopy, just making some suggestions of where the tree trunk is, and then drawing all of these branches as well as the clusters of needles which are growing out to the sides. So like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to look super realistic. I just want to draw a nice tapering looking shape for this tree, and as long as I have a nice contrast between the areas of lighter value and darker value, I'm going to be able to make it look pretty realistic. So I'm going to be adding some more trees, but first I'm going to add a touch of blue to this one as well, especially on the shadow side. And after that I'm going to be adding some white on top of all of that to make it look like the tree is covered with some snow. Now, an important point here is to understand that you can only do this on sandpaper. You wouldn't really be able to do this on regular paper, because on regular paper you can't really work from dark to light. On sandpaper you can, but of course there are limitations as to how many layers the sandpaper can take. I tend to use this smoother 1000 grit sandpaper, but it can still take a few layers. That's why you can see me adding these very light white details on top of the darker ones. And I even had to subdue some of them on the right side, on the left side, sorry, because that's my shadow side, so that the right side or the light side would appear a little bit lighter because it's facing towards the light source. And I'm just adding some random details, just trying to create that illusion of detail so that I can make this look a bit more complex, even though obviously I'm not going to draw every single branch in there. Just want to have a nice range of value, and I want to have a bit of contrast between the lighter portions and the darker portions, obviously. I added a touch of green here and there, even though I'm not really sure whether my camera will be able to pick up on it, but I added a touch of green as well as that darker Prussian blue as well. So I mostly wanted these bluish tones to dominate my scene, and as you can see I'm using them for the snow as well. Just fidgeting with the shape of this tree a little bit more because I wasn't really entirely happy with it, and just making some minor corrections. So I'm going to draw another one here to the left. This one is going to be slightly smaller because it's slightly further away. Obviously the size of these trees depends mostly on their position in relation to our viewpoint. And the one that I drew first is obviously the closest one. That's why it's going to be the tallest and the largest one here. I just made some corrections to its shape. So now I'm working on the other one using the same approach, basically drawing the darker areas first and adding a touch of some other colors in there, some blue and some green, and then adding some lighter bits with a white colored pencil to make it look like there's some snow on top of those drooping branches. So you can see how my scene is starting to look and it's starting to gain a little more depth. The mountain itself already looked pretty three-dimensional because of the nice contrast that I was able to achieve between the lighter areas and the shadow areas. Of course, the right side of the mountain is largely unfinished, but I mostly like to work from left to right because I'm right-handed, just to prevent smudging and to prevent my hand from removing any of the pigment that I've already, in the areas that I've already done. And under my hand I like to put a piece of glassine paper to minimize smudging, even though I have to tell you, when you work in colored pencils, especially hard colored pencils like these Faber-Castell oil-based Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils, there's not that much smudging. If I were doing this in pastels or pastel pencils, obviously there would be quite a bit more residue flying around, and it would be a lot easier for me to spoil any of the things that I've already done if I were to touch it accidentally. And that's one of the reasons why I prefer colored pencils, because you don't really need a fixative with them, or at least you don't need as much fixative. And even if you use it, it doesn't really alter the colors that much. With pastels you have a problem because they're never really fixed, and if you try fixing them a bit more thoroughly, there will be a significant color change. So those are some of the disadvantages of pastel pencils, even though pastel pencils do tend to lend themselves better to drawing these landscapes. But since this is a smaller format, I don't know the exact size, but I think this is around 7 times 9 inches, so it's a smaller size drawing. On these smaller size drawings, I think that colored pencils are quite adequate. And another advantage of colored pencils in comparison to the pastels is obviously that you have the opportunity to make things a lot more detailed, because colored pencils are great for drawing details. Notice on the left, under those trees, I also added a bit of shadow on that snow. That'll also make the trees appear a little bit more realistic and a bit more three-dimensional. Just so that it doesn't look like they're hanging in mid-air or just hanging over the snow. So I want to make them a part of the scene, and obviously adding some shadows is an important part of that process. So I'm working a little bit more on some shadow areas of the mountain here at the bottom. I wasn't really sure what shapes I was going to achieve at first, so I did a bit of experimenting first by adding some lighter portions and then some darker portions, and then I started adding some random textures, because the thing is that whenever you put one of those lighter marks, you see, and I like to do this with a sharp colored pencil, white colored pencil, and whenever you put down one of these lighter marks, you make it look like that's a rocky part of the mountain which is sticking out and facing towards the light source. And whenever you add some of these darker marks, you make it look like this is one of those rocks which are in the shadow and which are facing away from the light source. So it's all about creating that illusion of detail without actually having to draw every single bit, every single rock. So just by drawing a few suggestions of these rocks, you can create a very nice looking, uneven looking rocky terrain covered with snow, obviously, because I'm going for a winter scene here. I also thought about maybe adding some snowflakes to make it look like it's snowing, but eventually I decided against it. I thought that the scene was already good enough as it was. So I just decided to finish the work on the mountain, but here at the bottom again, I wasn't really sure what these rocks, what these shapes are going to look like. So I just kind of simplified things a little bit, added some darker tones to create some shadows, and after that I decided to move on to the foreground and and the midground obviously, and to add some more trees in front. And once I do that, it'll be clear to me whether I need to refine any more details on the mountain itself. So these trees in the distance, they also have these tapering shapes where I draw the vertical line to indicate the tree trunk first, and then I add some shapes on the sides. I add these horizontal shapes to make it look like these are some branches, and obviously I try to make the trees taper towards the top. And when I add some snow on top of those, I make it look like the branches are kind of drooping down a little bit under the weight of the snow. And obviously the trees in the back are a lot smaller than the ones in the front, and actually you can use that difference in size to suggest distance and depth in your drawing. This is a trick that I often like to use when I have a lot of objects in the midground. I like to vary the size of those objects so that I can convey that feeling of distance to the viewer. And the ones which are further back, they're going to have less detail and less texture, and the ones which are closer to us, they're going to be a little bit more detailed and with slightly more rough and slightly more refined textures. I'm also trying to make some indications of the shape of the terrain. Here, as you can see, I'm making it look like these trees in the foreground are on a slight slope, which is slightly in front of the other ones. And then on the right, I'm going to add another slope. So I'm just trying to make some indications that this is a very uneven terrain. Even though it's covered with snow, I just don't want to make it look too monotonous. And these lighter bits that I'm adding, obviously those are top parts of those slopes which are facing towards the light source. As I already mentioned, I'm using a couple of other brands of colored pencils. For these white bits, I also used a Staedtler white colored pencil because it's a little bit less opaque. As I've already explained, it's a little bit less opaque than the Faber-Castell Polychromos, and it's a bit easier for me to blend and create these grayish areas where I simply allow a bit more of the background color, the color of the sandpaper, to come through to achieve some shadow effects, or maybe some variations in the color and the shape of the terrain. I'm adding another tall tree here on the right. So this one is also going to be slightly in front of the other ones, but not quite as tall as the one, or as large as the one on the left. So the one on the left, the second one on the left, is obviously the closest one to our viewpoint, and that's why it's the largest. And here I'm just kind of fidgeting with some of the details on the mountain, just adding some lighter bits and adding some random details here and there, because I realized that some portions of that bottom part of the mountain will not be obscured by the canopies of the trees, so I decided to add a bit more detail there because I don't want to make it look too simple. I don't want to make it look unfinished. So I'm adding some more of these rocks and some more of these details in the shadow side, as well as some more of those lighter bits with a white colored pencil, which look like parts of the mountain which are facing towards the light source. And I'm adding these details with a black colored pencil. So here it's time to finish these trees at the bottom of the mountain. So some of the ones which are much further in the distance are obviously a lot smaller, but most of the ones that we can see, most of the ones whose shape we can really discern, are a little bit closer to us. I also added some variation in the terrain in the foreground, adding some shadow areas and some lighter areas, just to make it look like that part of the terrain is a bit more uneven. And I finished filling in these other parts of the foreground with some white colored pencil on the right as well, just to make sure that I have everything covered with that white colored pencil. And the top part of this slope in the foreground obviously is going to be a bit lighter than the rest. So I'm doing a bit of blending with a blending stump just to avoid having too much of that background color of the sandpaper coming through. I want it to be a bit lighter. And adding a touch of those bluish tones as well, because I've used those on the mountain as well, so I want to stay consistent with those blue tones which I use elsewhere, and I'm even using a touch of that light phthalo blue which I used for the shadow side of the mountain as well as the sky. So I want to achieve a little bit more balance there. I didn't really like this part of the mountain here all the way to the left, so I decided to modify its shape just a little bit. I decided to modify the angle of this slope, and I think it looks a bit better now. Obviously these are just some tiny details that you don't have to do when you're drawing a landscape. It's just that if I'm not happy with a shape, I just correct it. But obviously you can't do this forever. Eventually you have to put the pencil down. I decided to add like a small path in the snow here in the middle. I added the shadow side first, combining some darker colors and this bluish color. But then on the part of the path which is facing towards the light source, which in this case is the left side, I added a bit of white colored pencil. The reason why I'm adding some lighter tones here on the left rather than on the right is because the left part of that path is facing towards the light source, and the right side is sloping down and facing away from the light source. So you always have to think in 3 dimensions, and you always have to be aware of the position of your light source. Anyway, just to make the foreground a bit more interesting, I'm going to add a few of those blades of dry grass or maybe some bushes which are sticking out of the snow. Sticking out of the snow here and there. I'm going to vary their size a little bit, making the ones which are closer to us a bit taller, adding a tiny bit of shadow under them, and that's pretty much going to complete the scene. I like stacking these smaller elements in front of the others so that I can create more depth in my drawing. But I think that the mountain itself will be the first thing that will draw the attention of the viewer, because obviously it's in the center and there is the largest amount of contrast around it. So I'm just adding some lighter bits to the foreground, making this terrain, making the snow terrain a little bit more detailed and a bit more realistic. And I will be wrapping things up soon. I just want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, and also don't forget to check out my other videos. If you want to see longer videos, full-length narrated videos, and some additional content, you should check out my Patreon. You will find a lot more content there. And the drawing is now finished, so I'm putting my signature down in the lower right corner, and that's it. I hope you like how the scene turned out. I was pretty happy with the mountain, especially the top of the mountain where I put in a lot of detail, and I was pretty patient with that first part of the drawing process. So once again, don't forget to subscribe, and also don't forget to give me a like and comment on my videos, because all of these actions mean a lot for my channel. Thanks again for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one, and bye for now.